The door of the diner exploded inward before the bell even finished ringing. Glass rained across the counter. Sarah screamed as a chair flew past her head. And Robert Hale, the quiet old man who poured coffee every morning with shaking, gentle hands, set down his spatula, looked at the three men wrecking his life's work, and said nothing at all. He just started walking toward them. Within 10 seconds, the town of Millbrook would learn a truth buried for 30 years. This old veteran wasn't hiding from his past. His past was a war machine, and it had just woken up. Before we go any further, if stories like this keep you up past midnight, hit that subscribe button right now, and don't forget to like this video. And in the comments, tell me what city you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and I want to know exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to where it all began. Millbrook didn't have much. A gas station with a flickering sign. A church with a roof that leaked every spring. And Hale's Diner, a squat brick building on Route 9, with a hand-painted sign and windows that fogged up every morning around 5:30, right when the coffee started brewing. Robert Hale had run that diner for almost 20 years. Nobody really knew where he came from before that. He never talked about it. Not once. Not even when old Frank Doyle, who'd known him the longest, tried to pry it out of him over a slice of pie one Sunday afternoon. "You ever gonna tell me where you learned to flip eggs like that, Bobby?" Frank had asked, half joking. Robert had just smiled that same tired, faraway smile he always gave when the past brushed too close. "Army taught me patience, Frank. Patience and eggs." That was as far as it ever went. Sarah Mills had been working there for almost 3 years now. 24 years old, sharp-eyed, the kind of girl who noticed things other people missed. And what she noticed about Robert wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, and that quiet bothered her more than anything. He never raised his voice. He never lost his temper, not even when drunk truckers got rowdy at 2 in the morning. He moved like a man who had once needed to move fast, and had spent decades training himself to move slow instead. And there was the photo. A small, faded photograph tucked into the corner of an old frame behind the register, half hidden behind a calendar. Nobody bothered to flip anymore. In it, a much younger Robert stood beside a row of motorcycles, flanked by men with hard eyes and harder jaws. Sarah had asked about it once. "Just some old friends," Robert had said, and turned back to the grill before she could ask anything else. She let it go. Mostly. That morning, the morning everything started to unravel, was supposed to be just like every other morning. The bacon was sizzling. The coffee pot gurgled on the burner. An old country song hummed low from the radio on the shelf, half drowned out by the clatter of forks on plates. Frank Doyle sat in his usual booth by the window, the newspaper folded in front of him like a shield against the world. "You hear about that gas station on Maple getting shaken down?" Frank said, not looking up. "Some fellas rolled through there last week. Told old man Peterson he owed 'em for protection." Robert flipped a strip of bacon without looking over. Protection from what? From them, apparently. Frank chuckled, but there wasn't much humor in it. "New gang in town, calling themselves the Black Vipers. Curtis Lane runs 'em. You believe that snake name for a snake?" Sarah, refilling coffee 2 booths down, felt a small chill crawl up her spine. She'd heard whispers about the Black Vipers from a cousin who lived 2 towns over. Whispers about broken windows. About men who didn't ask twice. "They won't come here," she said, more to convince herself than anyone else. Robert said nothing. He just kept flipping bacon, the same calm rhythm, the same unreadable face. But something in his jaw had tightened. Just slightly. Just enough that if you'd known him for 20 years, really known him, you might have caught it. Frank didn't catch it. Sarah didn't either. Not yet. The bell above the door jingled at exactly 9:47 that morning, and the entire mood of the diner shifted before anyone said a word. 3 men walked in. Leather jackets. Boots that hit the floor too hard, too deliberately, like they wanted everyone to hear them coming. And in front, walking with the loose, confident swagger of a man who'd never been told no in his life, was Curtis Lane. He was younger than Sarah expected. Maybe 32, 33. Slicked back hair, a thin scar above his eyebrow, and a smile that looked friendly until you noticed his eyes never matched it. He slid into a booth like he owned it. "Coffee," he said, not to anyone in particular. "Black." Sarah glanced at Robert. Robert nodded once, calm, steady, and poured the cup himself, carrying it over with the same unhurried pace he carried everything. Curtis took a sip, made a face like it disappointed him, and set the cup down hard enough to rattle the saucer. "You're the owner," he said, not a question. "That's right," Robert said. "Nice little place." Curtis looked around slowly like he was doing inventory. "Real homey, real vulnerable." The two men behind him chuckled. Frank's newspaper had gone still in his hands. Sarah felt her stomach drop. "What can I do for you?" Robert asked, his voice flat, almost bored. Curtis smiled wider. "You can do yourself a favor. $200 a week. Cash. Every Friday. And nothing bad happens to this cute little diner of yours." The diner went dead silent. Even the radio seemed to hush itself. Sarah's hands tightened around the coffee pot. She wanted to scream at Curtis to get out, wanted to call the police right then and there, but something about the way Robert was standing made her freeze instead. He wasn't scared. He wasn't even tense. He looked almost amused. The way a man looks when he's heard the same joke 1,000 times before, and it still hasn't gotten any funnier. "No," Robert said. One word. Flat. Final. Curtis blinked like he hadn't quite processed it. "Excuse me? You heard me?" Robert said. "No." The two men behind Curtis straightened up, suddenly alert, sensing the air change. Curtis stood slowly from the booth, his smile twitching at the corners, somewhere between amused and offended. "You know who you're talking to, old man?" "I know exactly who I'm talking to," Robert said, wiping his hands on his apron, completely unbothered. "A boy who thinks a leather jacket and a bad attitude make him dangerous." Frank nearly choked on his coffee. Sarah's jaw dropped. The two enforcers behind Curtis tensed like dogs waiting for a command. Curtis's smile vanished entirely. For one long second, the diner held its breath. Then Curtis laughed, a short, sharp bark, more performance than amusement, and shook his head. "You got guts, old man, I'll give you that. Stupid guts. But guts." He pointed a finger at Robert, almost playful, almost threatening. "Friday. 200. Or we come back and remind you why people don't say no to us." He turned and walked out, his men trailing behind him like shadows. The bell jingled again, almost mockingly, as the door swung shut. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Frank exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for a year. "Bobby, what in the hell was that?" Robert picked up Curtis's half-empty coffee cup, looked at it for a moment, and poured it down the drain. "That," he said quietly, "was a boy who's never been told no before." Sarah's hands were still shaking. "Robert, those people are dangerous. You heard what they did to Peterson's gas station." "I heard." Robert's voice was calm, but something flickered behind his eyes. Something old. Something Sarah had never seen before. Just for a second. Then it was gone, buried back under decades of careful, practiced peace. "You're not actually going to refuse them, are you?" Sarah pressed. "Just pay them. It's not worth—" "It's worth everything," Robert said, cutting her off, not harshly but firmly enough that she stopped talking. "You pay men like that once, Sarah, you'll be paying them forever, and it'll never be enough. It never is." Frank stared at him. "You sound like you know that from experience." Robert didn't answer. He just turned back to the grill, and the conversation, like always, quietly died. The rest of the day passed in an uneasy hum. Customers came and went, the regulars whispering about Curtis Lane's visit, some of them already nervous, some already planning to quietly close their shops early on Fridays, just to avoid trouble. That evening, after the last customer left, and Sarah was wiping down the counters, she finally worked up the nerve to ask the question that had been gnawing at her all day. "That photo," she said, nodding toward the frame behind the register. "The one with the motorcycles. Who are those men really?" Robert didn't look up from the dishes. "Old friends, like I said." "Robert." Her voice was soft but insistent. The way you talked to Curtis today, that wasn't a diner owner talking to a bully. That was something else. Somebody who's seen worse than him. 8. For a long moment, Robert said nothing. The water ran over the dishes slow and steady, a sound that filled the silence between them. There are things in a man's past, he finally said, that he doesn't bring into his present. Not because he's ashamed of them, but because he's afraid of what happens if he lets them back in. Sarah waited, hoping he'd say more. He didn't. He simply dried his hands on his apron, turned off the lights, and locked the door behind them as they left the same way he always did, the same calm routine he'd followed for 20 years. But that night, lying awake in her small apartment above the hardware store, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. That a door long sealed inside Robert Hale had just creaked open just a little, and something old and dangerous was stirring behind it. She had no idea how right she was. 3 days later, on a gray Thursday afternoon, with rain threatening on the horizon, the diner was busier than usual. The lunch rush had just started winding down a few truckers in the back booth, 2 old farmers arguing about crop prices near the window, and Frank in his usual spot, nursing his 3rd cup of coffee. Sarah was balancing a tray of plates when the door slammed open so hard, the bell flew off its hook entirely. 3 men stormed in. Not Curtis. Different men, bigger meaner. The kind of men whose faces looked like they'd been carved out of granite and bad decisions. The leader, a hulking man with a shaved head and a tattoo creeping up his neck, grabbed the first table he reached and flipped it over. Plates shattered. Coffee sprayed across the floor. The farmers scrambled back, and one of the truckers shouted something that got swallowed in the chaos. "Where's the owner?" The bald man bellowed. Sarah dropped her tray glass, exploding around her feet, and instinctively backed toward the counter, right into the path of the second man who shoved her hard enough that she slammed into the counter's edge and crumpled to the floor, pain shooting through her hip. "Sarah!" Frank's voice cracked with panic as he lunged forward, only for the third man to grab him by the collar and throw him back into his booth. Chairs scattered. A window cracked from a stray elbow. The diner, Robert's quiet, peaceful diner, the one constant in this whole forgotten town, was being torn apart in front of everyone's eyes. And through the kitchen window, Robert watched it happen. For one heartbeat time seemed to stretch impossibly long. Sarah on the floor, gripping her side. Frank trying to scramble up from the booth. The bald man kicking over another table just for the satisfaction of the sound it made. Then Robert set down the spatula. Slowly. Deliberately. Like a man closing a book he'd read 1,000 times before finally ready to put it back on the shelf. He stepped out from behind the counter. "Hey!" the bald man snarled, turning toward him chest puffed out, ready to deliver whatever threat Curtis had sent him to deliver. "You the old man who thinks he can say no to—" He never finished the sentence. What happened next took less than 10 seconds. Sarah, still on the floor, would later swear she barely understood what she was seeing. It was too fast, too clean, too controlled to belong to the gentle old man who poured her coffee every morning. Robert moved like water, finding the fastest path downhill. His hand caught the bald man's wrist mid-swing, twisted it with brutal efficiency, and in the same motion drove him face first into the counter. The man's knees buckled before he even hit the ground. The second man lunged from the side, a wild, panicked swing, more instinct than skill. Robert sidestepped it like it was nothing, caught the man's collar, and used his own momentum against him, sending him crashing through the front door in an explosion of splintering wood and shattered glass. He landed in the gravel parking lot with a groan, not moving. The third man, younger, clearly the least experienced of the three, froze entirely. His eyes went wide, his hands trembling, his bravado collapsing in real time. Robert didn't even need to touch him. He simply stepped forward, his expression as calm and unreadable as it had been every single morning for the past 20 years, and said quietly, "Leave. Now." The young man didn't argue. He scrambled backward, tripped over an overturned chair, and bolted out the broken doorway without looking back even once. Silence. Total, absolute silence, except for the groaning bald man slowly trying to push himself off the floor, and Sarah's ragged breathing as she stared up at Robert from where she sat on the ground. He turned to her immediately, all the cold precision draining out of his posture, replaced instantly by gentle concern. He crouched beside her, careful, almost fragile in his movements, now a complete contradiction to what he'd just done seconds ago. "Sarah, are you hurt?" She stared at him, breath-catching, unable to find words for several long seconds. "Robert, what was that?" He didn't answer right away. He helped her to her feet, checked Frank, who was shaken but unharmed, and only once he was certain everyone was safe did he allow himself to exhale a long, heavy breath that seemed to carry the weight of something far older than this single afternoon. "I told you," he said, finally, quiet enough that only she could hear. "There are things in a man's past he doesn't bring into his present." He looked down at his own hands, the same hands that flipped bacon every morning, the same hands that had just dismantled 3 armed men in under 10 seconds without breaking a sweat. Looks like the past doesn't always ask permission. Outside, the bald man finally managed to drag himself upright, blood trickling from his nose, and staggered toward his truck without a word, glancing back at the diner at Robert, with something that looked an awful lot like fear. Word would reach Curtis Lane within the hour. And when it did, the first thing he'd ask, the only thing that mattered now, was a single chilling question. Who exactly is Robert Hale? Because no ordinary diner owner moved like that. No tired old veteran dismantled 3 trained enforcers in 10 seconds without a scratch. Somewhere in Millbrook, an old name buried for 30 years, whispered only in the darkest corners of biker history, was about to surface again. A name connected to blood brotherhood and a war most people thought had ended long ago. A name tied to the Hells Angels. And once that name reached Curtis Lane's ears, nothing in Millbrook would ever be quiet again. Orchestrated narrative continuation with dialogue-driven pacing and strategic plot twists. Orchestrated narrative continuation with dialogue-driven pacing and strategic plot twists. The bald man's name was Dale Cruikshank, and by the time he stumbled into the Black Viper's clubhouse with blood still crusted under his nose, the story had already started growing legs of its own. "Say that again," Curtis said, leaning back in his chair, a half-smoked cigarette pinched between 2 fingers. "Say it slow this time, because what I just heard makes no damn sense." "He moved like nothing I ever seen, Curtis." Dale's voice cracked, and he hated himself for it, hated how small he sounded in front of the others. "One second I'm standing there, next second my face is in the counter and Marcus is flying through the front door like he weighs nothing." "He's an old man," Curtis said, slow, deliberate, like he was trying to convince himself as much as anyone else in the room. "A 60-something diner cook. I'm telling you what I saw." Across the room, leaning against a pool table with a beer sweating in his hand, sat a man named Otis Greer, older than the rest of the Vipers, by a couple decades, gray creeping into his beard, the kind of man who'd been in enough rooms like this one to know when something didn't add up. "Hale," Otis muttered almost to himself. Curtis's eyes snapped toward him. "What did you say?" "The name, Hale." Otis set his beer down slow, like the weight of the word itself needed somewhere to rest. "Where'd you say this diner was again?" "Route 9. Why, you know something." Otis didn't answer right away. He just stared at the wall behind Curtis's head, like he was looking through it, looking back through years that none of the younger men in that room had even been alive for. "Robert Hale," Otis said finally. "First name's Robert." Dale, still holding a bloody rag to his nose, nodded slowly. "That's him. That's what the waitress called him." The room went quiet in a way it hadn't before. Not the tense, charged quiet of men waiting for orders, but something colder. Something that made even Curtis sit up a little straighter. "You gonna tell us what you're thinking, old man?" Curtis said, an edge of impatience cutting through his words. "Or are we gonna sit here playing 20 questions? Otis ran a hand down his face. "Before your time, Curtis. Way before. I was running with a crew out of Tulsa back in the early 90s, doing deals nobody wants to talk about now. And there was a name that came up when things got serious, when negotiations broke down and people needed convincing. And the name was Hale. Robert Hale." Otis's jaw tightened. Man was tied in deep with the Hells Angels. Not some weekend rider with a vest and a beer gut, I mean deep. Enforcement. The kind of man they sent when talking didn't work anymore. The cigarette in Curtis's fingers had burned down to nothing forgotten. You're telling me the diner cook who told me no 3 days ago used to run with the Angels? I'm telling you, Otis said, that if it's the same man, and Lord, I hope to God it ain't, then you just sent 3 of your boys to rough up somebody who's killed men for less than what you did to him. The silence that followed was the kind that made the air feel thinner. Curtis stood up, paced once across the room, came back, sat back down. His mind was working fast now, trying to fit pieces that didn't want to fit. If that's true, if that's really him, why is he running a diner in the middle of nowhere? Why ain't he still out there doing whatever men like that do? Because men like that retire one of 2 ways, Otis said quietly. Either somebody puts them in the ground, or they put themselves somewhere so far from their old life that the past can't find them. Curtis looked toward the broken window of the clubhouse, toward the dark road outside that led eventually back to Route 9, back to a quiet diner with a busted door and a coffee pot that probably needed replacing. Well, he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. Looks like the past just found him anyway. Back at the diner, the night had settled into something heavy and uneasy. Robert had boarded up the broken door with plywood from the storage shed, hammering each nail with the same steady, unhurried rhythm he used for everything. Except Sarah noticed his hands weren't quite as steady as they usually were. Just slightly. Just enough. She sat on the counter, an ice pack pressed against her hip, watching him work in silence for almost 10 minutes before she finally spoke. You're not going to tell me, are you? Robert paused hammer mid-swing, then lowered it slowly. Tell you what. Don't do that. Her voice came out sharper than she intended, but she didn't apologize for it. Don't play dumb with me, Robert. Not after what I just watched you do. I've worked here 3 years. I've seen you handle drunk truckers, angry customers, that one guy who tried to skip out on his bill twice, and you've never not once moved like that. Robert set the hammer down on the counter, the metallic clink echoing through the empty diner. He looked at her for a long moment, weighing something behind his eyes that Sarah couldn't quite read. You ever hear of a man needing 2 lives to survive one? He asked. No, Sarah said carefully. I don't think I have. There was a time. Robert said, his voice dropping into something quieter, more distant. When I was somebody very different from who I am now. I didn't choose that life out of nowhere, Sarah. It chose me, and I went along with it because I didn't know any better, and because when you're young and angry and lost, brotherhood looks a lot like family, even when it's built on things that should never be called family. Sarah's breath caught. The Hells Angels. Robert's silence was its own answer. I was 19 when I joined, he continued after a moment. Fresh out of a war nobody back home wanted to hear about. I came back different, came back hollow. And there were men, older men, who saw that hollow place in me and filled it with purpose. Loyalty. Brotherhood. He let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh, but there was no humor in it at all. They didn't tell me the price of that purpose until I was already in too deep to walk away. What happened? Sarah asked, barely above a whisper. Things happened that I'm not proud of, Robert said. Things I spent the better part of 30 years trying to bury so deep that I'd forget they were ever part of me. He looked at his own hands again the same way he had after the fight, like he didn't recognize them anymore. I thought I had. God help me, I thought I really had. But you didn't forget, Sarah said. Not really. No. Robert admitted. You don't forget. You just get good at pretending the door's locked. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. The plywood over the broken door creaked slightly in the night wind, and somewhere outside, a dog barked twice and went quiet. Are they going to come back? Sarah finally asked. The Black Vipers. After what happened today, are they going to leave it alone, or? They're not going to leave it alone, Robert said simply. Men like Curtis don't back down from embarrassment. They double down on it. He's going to come back, and he's going to come back angrier, and probably with more men. Then we call the police. Tonight. Right now. The police in this county, Robert said, not unkindly, are 3 deputies and a sheriff who's 2 years from retirement and doesn't want trouble on his watch. By the time they actually do something, if they do anything at all, this whole street could already belong to the Vipers. Sarah's hands tightened around the ice pack. So what do we do? Robert was quiet for a long moment, staring at the boarded-up door like it was a wound that hadn't finished bleeding yet. We wait, he said, and when they come, and they will come, I deal with it. By yourself. I've dealt with worse by myself. That's not an answer, Robert. That's a deflection. Sarah hopped down from the counter, wincing slightly at the pain in her hip, and stood in front of him, arms crossed, refusing to let him brush past this, the way he brushed past every other hard conversation. I'm not going anywhere. This is my job, my town, and frankly, after what I saw today, I think I deserve to know exactly what we're dealing with. Robert studied her for a long moment. Really studied her the way he used to study men across a negotiating table decades ago, looking for weakness, looking for resolve. He found only resolve. All right, he said finally quietly. All right. Onion. The next morning came gray and heavy, the kind of sky that seemed to be holding its breath along with the rest of the town. News of what happened at Hale's diner had already spread through Millbrook faster than Robert could have anticipated. Small towns worked that way, secrets traveling on the wind like pollen, landing in every ear by sunrise. Frank arrived earlier than usual, looking like he hadn't slept much. He sat in his usual booth, but this time he didn't open his newspaper. He just watched Robert move behind the counter, watched him with new eyes. Eyes that were trying to reconcile 20 years of friendship with 10 seconds of violence that didn't fit anywhere into the man he thought he knew. You gonna say something, Frank? Robert said without turning around. Or are you just gonna sit there staring holes into my back all morning? Frank cleared his throat. I heard things, after yesterday. People talking. People always talk. They're saying you used to ride with the angels, real deep into it. Saying you did things. Frank hesitated, choosing his words like he was walking across thin ice. Things that don't square up with the man who's been pouring my coffee every morning for almost 2 decades. Robert finally turned around, and for the first time in years, Frank saw something in his old friend's face that looked almost like shame. It's true, Robert said simply. All of it probably depending on what version of the story's making the rounds. Frank sat back slowly, processing. Why didn't you ever tell me? Because that man died a long time ago, Frank. Or I thought he did. Robert wiped down the counter, a habit more than a necessity at this point. I came to Millbrook to bury him for good. Wasn't looking to dig him back up. And now, Robert's hand stilled on the counter. Now it looks like somebody else dug him up for me. The bell above the door jingled, not with the violent slam of yesterday, but with a slow, almost hesitant chime. Every head in the diner turned, half expecting trouble, half bracing for it. It was just an old man, gray-haired, leaning heavily on a cane, wearing a faded denim jacket with patches sewn into the shoulders, patches that to most people would mean nothing at all. But Robert recognized them instantly, and something in his face went pale. Well, I'll be damned, the old man said, his voice rough with age and cigarettes. Robert Hale, thought you were dead, brother. Sarah, watching from behind the counter, felt the temperature in the room drop several degrees. Walter, Robert said slowly, like the name itself cost him something to say. What in God's name are you doing here? Walter Briggs smiled a smile that didn't quite reach his tired, watery eyes. Word travels fast in certain circles, Bobby. Real fast when it's about a ghost showing his face again. He glanced around the diner, taking in the boarded-up door, the faint scuff marks on the floor from yesterday's chaos. Looks like you already had visitors. Black Vipers, Robert said. Local gang, trying to shake down the town. And you told them no. Walter chuckled low and dry. Some things never change, huh? Walter. Robert's voice carried a warning now. Why are you here? Walter's smile faded slowly, replaced by something heavier, something that made the air in the diner feel thick and dangerous. He lowered himself into the nearest booth with a groan, setting his cane against the table. "Because somebody's been asking about you," Walter said. "Up north, old business, Bobby, business you thought you walked away clean from 30 years ago." Robert's jaw tightened. "There's no clean walk away from what I did." "No," Walter agreed. "There ain't. And there's people who remember that real well. People who never forgave you for leaving the way you did, taking what you took with you when you went." Sarah, listening from a few feet away, felt a chill crawl up her spine. "What did he take?" she asked before she could stop herself. Both men looked at her. Walter with mild surprise, Robert with something closer to dread. "Sarah," Robert said quietly, "go check on the kitchen." "Robert, please." She hesitated, torn between obedience and the burning need to understand exactly what kind of storm was circling her boss, her friend, the man she'd trusted with her life just yesterday. But something in his eyes, pleading, exhausted, scared in a way she'd never seen from him before, made her step back. She retreated toward the kitchen but stayed close enough to the doorway to still hear every word. "Walter," Robert said. Once she was gone, his voice dropping low, "Say what you came to say." "There's a man named Decker," Walter said. "You remember Decker?" Robert's hands curled slowly into fists at his sides. "I remember. He's been looking for you for 30 years, Bobby. Looking for the man who walked out on a debt that got 3 of his brothers killed. Looking for the man who took the money meant to settle that debt and disappeared into thin air." Walter leaned forward, his voice dropping into something almost gentle, almost apologetic. "And somebody finally found you. Word's spreading through the old network. It's only a matter of time before it reaches him." The diner felt impossibly silent. "How long do I have?" Robert asked. "Weeks. Maybe less." Walter's eyes softened slightly. "I came to warn you, old friend. Came because despite everything, despite what you did, you saved my life once a long time ago, and I never forgot that. But I can't protect you from this. Nobody can. Decker's not the kind of man who lets 30-year-old debts go unpaid." Robert stood frozen behind the counter, the weight of decades pressing down on him all at once, the black vipers circling like vultures on one side, and now this, an older, deadlier shadow crawling up from the depths of a past he'd spent half his life trying to drown. "And the money," Robert said quietly. "You think he still believes I have it. I think Decker doesn't care what you believe," Walter said. "He cares about making an example, showing the world that nobody walks away from his family without paying for it eventually." Robert closed his eyes for a long moment, and when he opened them, something had shifted. Something resigned, something almost like acceptance settling over his features. "Then I suppose," he said quietly, "the past isn't done with me yet." Walter rose slowly from the booth, leaning heavily on his cane. "For what it's worth, Bobby, you look like you built something good here, something real." He glanced around the modest diner, at the chipped tables and faded curtains, at all the small, ordinary beauty of a quiet life. Shame it might not last. He shuffled toward the door, pausing only once to look back. "Watch your back, both directions now." The bell jingled softly as he disappeared into the gray morning, leaving behind a silence so heavy it felt like it might crush the walls inward. Sarah stepped slowly out of the kitchen, her face pale, her eyes wide with 100 unanswered questions. "Robert," she whispered, "who's Decker?" Robert didn't answer right away. He moved to the window, watching Walter's car pull slowly out of the gravel lot, watching the road stretch empty and gray toward a horizon that suddenly felt much closer than it used to. "Someone I hoped I'd never have to think about again," he said finally. "What did you do to him?" Robert turned to face her, and for the first time since she'd known him, she saw real fear in his eyes. Not the calm, controlled fear of a man bracing for a fight he knew he could win, but something deeper, something that had been buried under 30 years of pretending it didn't exist. "I didn't do anything to him," Robert said. "I did something for myself. I ran. And men like Decker, they don't forgive running, not ever." By the time the diner closed that evening, Word had already spread through Millbrook in both directions about the gang trying to muscle into town, and now in hushed whispers between neighbors about the strange old biker who'd shown up asking for Robert Hale by a name nobody local had ever heard. Curtis Lane heard about it within hours. He sat in the back room of the clubhouse, a cheap burner phone pressed to his ear, listening to a contact 2 counties over describe exactly what they'd witnessed driving past Hale's diner that morning. An old patched biker, walking in, talking low with Robert, walking out, looking like he'd just delivered bad news to a dead man. "You sure it was a Hell's Angels patch?" Curtis asked. "Sure as I'm standing here," the voice on the other end said. "And word's already crawling up the grapevine that somebody big is looking for your boy Hale. Somebody named Decker." Curtis's blood ran cold and hot all at once, cold with fear at a name he didn't recognize, but instinctively understood, carried weight, and hot with a dangerous, reckless kind of opportunity. He hung up the phone and turned to Otis, who was watching him with tired, knowing eyes. "You heard?" Curtis asked. "I heard," Otis said grimly. "This Decker," Curtis said slowly, an idea forming behind his eyes that made Otis's stomach twist with dread. "If he's hunting Hale for something from 30 years ago, and we get to Hale first—" "Curtis," Otis's voice carried a warning. "Don't. Think about it, old man. We don't gotta fight this guy ourselves. We just gotta soften him up. Let Decker do the rest." Curtis's smile crept back sharp and cruel. "And maybe, just maybe, we make sure whatever debt Hale's running from gets paid with something he's got. That diner, that land, whatever the old man's hiding." "You're playing with fire you don't understand," Otis said. "Men like Decker don't share. They don't negotiate. If you get in his way, he'll burn you down right along with Hale." "Maybe." Curtis stood straightening his jacket, his eyes gleaming with the reckless hunger of a man who'd never once paid for his own mistakes. "Or maybe I just made the smartest move of my life." Outside, the night had fully settled over Millbrook, over the quiet diner, with its boarded door over the gravel road that connected 2 dangerous worlds, now circling the same target over Robert Hale, who sat alone in his small apartment above the diner that night, staring at a steel box he hadn't opened in over a decade. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for it, fingers brushing across the cold metal lock. Inside that box was everything he'd tried to leave behind: a worn leather patch, an old photograph, a folded letter he'd never had the courage to send. And now, with 2 storms converging on his quiet life from opposite directions, Robert understood with a heavy sinking certainty that the box wouldn't stay closed much longer. Somewhere out there in the dark, a debt 30 years old was finally coming due. And this time there would be no walking away from it. The lock on the steel box gave way with a small metallic click that seemed louder than it had any right to be in the silence of Robert's apartment. He sat there for a long moment, just staring at the open lid, his hands resting on his knees, like he needed permission from his own body to reach inside. The leather patch sat on top exactly where he'd left it 11 years ago, frayed at the edges. The stitching faded, but still legible. Beneath it, a photograph. Beneath that, a folded letter yellowed with age, the ink slightly smeared like it had once gotten wet and dried again. He didn't touch any of it. Not yet. He just sat there breathing slow, listening to the old building creak around him, listening to the distant hum of a truck passing on Route 9, and for the first time in a long time, he let himself remember. The knock on his apartment door came just after 10 that night, sharp and insistent. Robert closed the box quickly, sliding it under the bed, before crossing the room and opening the door, to find Sarah standing there still in her work clothes, arms crossed against the night chill. "You weren't planning on telling me anything else, were you?" she said, not bothering with a greeting. "Sarah, it's late." "I don't care that it's late, Robert." She pushed past him into the apartment without waiting for an invitation, something she'd never done before. But tonight felt different. Tonight felt like the rules between them had changed the moment 3 men broke down his door. "You've got some bikers showing up out of nowhere talking about a man named Decker who apparently wants you dead over 30-year-old money. You've got a gang that's already proven they'll hurt people to get what they want. And you're sitting up here alone with a locked box like none of it's happening. Robert closed the door behind her, suddenly tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "What do you want me to say?" "I want you to tell me the truth. All of it. I deserve that much after what happened yesterday." He studied her for a long moment, the same stubborn fire he'd noticed the first day she walked into his diner, asking for a job fresh out of community college with nothing but grit and an empty bank account. He'd hired her on the spot, mostly because she reminded him of someone he used to know. Someone who didn't exist anymore. "Sit down," he said finally. She sat. He reached under the bed, pulled out the steel box, and set it on the small table between them. For a moment, he just looked at it, his jaw working like he was chewing on 30 years of words he'd never said out loud. "I was 19, he began, "when I came back from Vietnam. Wasn't the same person who left. Nobody who came back from that place was." His voice was quiet, distant, like he was speaking from somewhere far behind his own eyes. "Country didn't want us. Didn't understand us. I had nightmares I couldn't shake, and nobody to talk to about them. And then I met a man named Big Walt Walter's father, actually ironic as that sounds, and Big Walt understood. Or at least he made me believe he did. And he brought you into the Angels," Sarah said softly. "He brought me into a family," Robert corrected. "That's what it felt like anyway. Brothers who understood the war I was still fighting in my head. Brothers who gave me purpose when I had none." He opened the box, slowly lifting out the leather patch, turning it over in his hands like it weighed more than it should. It started small, riding together, drinking together. Then it got bigger. Protection rackets, drug runs, things that should have made me sick but didn't, because by then I'd convinced myself that loyalty mattered more than right and wrong. "What happened with Decker?" Robert's hands stilled on the patch. "Decker ran a rival chapter out near the coast. There was a deal, guns mostly, some product too, that went bad. Real bad. 3 of his men ended up dead in a warehouse that I was supposed to be guarding that night." He swallowed hard. "I wasn't the one who killed them, Sarah. I want you to understand that. But I was there. I knew what was happening, and I didn't stop it, and in Decker's eyes that makes me just as guilty as the men who pulled the triggers. So you ran." "I took money that was meant to settle the debt my chapter owed him for the deal going bad, money I knew would just disappear into somebody's pocket and never reach Decker's hands the way it was supposed to. And I used it to disappear myself, changed my name, cut every tie, built a life so quiet and so far removed from that world that I almost convinced myself it had happened to somebody else entirely." He set the patch down gently on the table like it might shatter. "Almost." Sarah sat in stunned silence for a long moment, processing everything, trying to reconcile the gentle man who'd taught her how to make the perfect omelet with the broken, dangerous history he was describing. "Do you still have it?" she asked finally. "The money. Most of it went into this diner years ago. What's left wouldn't even begin to cover what Decker thinks I owe him now. Not after 30 years of interest he's probably calculated in blood." "Then what does he want?" Robert's eyes met hers, heavy with a truth he clearly hated admitting. "He doesn't want the money anymore, Sarah. Money was never really the point. He wants what's owed for those 3 men. He wants to look the man who walked away from that warehouse in the eye and make him pay for walking away clean while his brothers didn't." The weight of that settled over the small apartment like a physical thing. "And Curtis," Sarah said slowly, piecing it together. "If he finds out about Decker—" "He already knows," Robert said grimly. "Walter as much as told me this morning that word's spreading. Curtis isn't stupid, whatever else he is. He'll see an opportunity in this. A way to use Decker's hunt against me, or worse, try to profit off it somehow." Sarah's stomach twisted. "So we've got a local gang trying to extort the whole town, and now a 30-year-old vendetta crawling in from the outside, and they might somehow be circling the same target. That target being me," Robert said quietly. "That target being us." Sarah corrected, her voice firm, despite the fear plainly written across her face. "I work here. I live here. Frank's practically family at this point. We're all standing in the blast radius whether we like it or not." Robert looked at her for a long moment, something fragile and grateful flickering behind his tired eyes. You could leave, you know. Walk away from all this. Find work somewhere safer. I'm not going anywhere, Sarah said without hesitation. And don't insult me by suggesting it again. Despite everything, despite the dread sitting heavy in his chest, Robert felt the corner of his mouth twitch upward just slightly. You remind me of someone I used to ride with. Wouldn't back down from a fight even when she should have. What happened to her? The small smile vanished as quickly as it appeared. She didn't make it out of that life. Not many of us did. The silence that followed sat heavy between them, broken only by the soft creak of the old building settling around them, and somewhere far off, the lonely howl of a freight train rolling through the night. 2 days passed in an uneasy quiet, the kind of quiet that felt less like peace and more like the air being sucked out of a room right before something exploded. The diner reopened with a temporary patch over the broken door, and customers trickled back in slowly, cautiously, some out of loyalty to Robert, some out of pure curiosity to see the man everyone in town was suddenly whispering about. Frank sat in his usual booth every morning, quieter than before, watching Robert with a mixture of old friendship and new uncertainty. But on the third day, the quiet shattered all at once. It started with a black SUV rolling slowly past the diner around noon, not stopping, just slowing down enough for the dark-tinted windows to seem like they were studying the building, studying the people inside. Sarah noticed it first, her stomach dropping as she watched it disappear down the road. "Robert," she said, voice tight. "We've got a problem." He'd already seen it. He'd been watching the road obsessively for 2 days now, the old instincts creeping back into his bones, whether he wanted them to or not. "That's not Curtis's crew," he said grimly. "Too clean, too quiet. Decker, or scouts sent ahead of him." By the time the lunch rush ended, the SUV had passed by twice more, and Robert's jaw had tightened into a permanent line of barely controlled tension. He pulled Sarah aside near the kitchen, his voice low and urgent. "I need you to listen to me carefully," he said. "If anything happens, if men come through that door that you don't recognize, men who don't look like Curtis's crew, I need you to get to the back office and lock the door. Don't try to be brave. Don't try to help. Just get safe. Robert, promise me, Sarah." She hesitated, every instinct in her screaming to argue, but something in his eyes, desperate pleading, more afraid for her than for himself, made her nod slowly. "I promise." The bell above the door jingled at that exact moment, and both of them turned sharply, bracing for the worst. It was just Frank, looking pale and out of breath, like he'd run the entire way from his house 3 blocks over. "Robert," he gasped, "you need to see this." He held up his phone, showing a video that had apparently been circulating through the town's local Facebook group all morning. Grainy footage taken from across the street, showing the SUV from earlier parked outside Peterson's gas station, showing 2 men in suits stepping out and speaking calmly with Old Man Peterson for several minutes before getting back in and driving away. "They're asking around," Frank said. "Asking about you specifically. Peterson said they showed him a photo, an old photo, black and white, of a younger you standing next to some bikes." Robert's blood ran cold. What did Peterson tell them? Said he didn't know nothing, which is mostly true, since he's only lived here 8 years. Frank's hands were shaking slightly as he lowered the phone. "But Bobby, they're getting close. Whoever these people are, they're not playing games. They've got resources, photos. They're hunting you methodical-like, not just stumbling around." Robert closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the walls of his carefully built quiet life crumbling faster than he'd anticipated. How long ago was this video taken? About an hour. An hour. That meant whoever was in that SUV could already know exactly where to find him. "Sarah," Robert said, his voice suddenly sharp with urgency. "Close up. Now. Lock the front. Kill. The lights tell anyone still inside they need to leave." Robert, what? "Now, Sarah." She moved immediately, the fear in his voice enough to override every question crowding her mind. Within minutes, the diner was empty, except for the 3 of them. The lights dimmed, the front door locked and bolted. Robert moved to the window, peering carefully through the gap in the curtains, scanning the empty road with the practiced eyes of a man who'd once made a career out of watching for exactly this kind of danger. "Frank," he said quietly, "go home. Lock your doors. Don't come back here until I tell you it's safe." "I ain't leaving you to deal with this alone, Bobby. This isn't your fight." "The hell it ain't!" Frank snapped, surprising both Robert and Sarah with the sudden steel in his voice. 20 years, Robert. 20 years you've poured my coffee, listened to me complain about my knees helped me when my wife passed, and I didn't know how to get out of bed in the morning. You don't get to tell me this ain't my fight when you've been part of my life longer than my own kids have. Robert stared at his old friend, something deeply moved flickering across his weathered face. "Frank, save it," Frank said, though his voice cracked slightly with emotion. "Just tell me what you need me to do." For a long moment, Robert said nothing. The weight of loyalty. Real loyalty, the kind he hadn't felt in 30 years, settling heavy and warm in his chest, despite the danger pressing in from every direction. "I need you to be my eyes," he said finally. "Watch the road. Anybody unfamiliar comes through town, you call me immediately." Frank nodded firmly. Done. The SUV didn't return that day, or the next. But on the third night, just past 11, Robert's phone rang, Frank's number flashing on the screen, his voice tight and breathless when Robert answered. "Bobby, they're here. 3 cars just pulled up outside the old Henderson barn on the edge of town. Bunch of men getting out moving like they know exactly what they're doing." Robert's grip on the phone tightened. "How many?" "Counting maybe 15, 20. Hard to tell in the dark. 20 men. Far more than Curtis's entire crew combined." "That's not Decker's full crew," Robert said grimly, more to himself than to Frank. "That's a war party." "Bobby, what in God's name did you do 30 years ago to deserve 20 armed men showing up in the middle of the night?" Robert closed his eyes, the old guilt crashing over him in a wave he hadn't felt this intensely in decades. "I survived something I shouldn't have, and I think tonight that mistake is finally coming to collect." He hung up the phone and turned to Sarah, who'd been listening with growing horror from across the room. "They're here," he said simply. "Tonight? Robert, what do we do?" Before she could finish, headlights swept across the diner's front windows, slow and deliberate, followed by the sound of multiple car doors opening in near-perfect unison outside. Robert moved instinctively, pulling Sarah back away from the windows, his body tensing into the same controlled readiness she'd witnessed during the attack days earlier. Except this time, there was something different in his eyes. Something heavier. Something that looked for the briefest moment like genuine fear. Because the men he'd fought off days ago were amateurs, thugs playing dress-up in leather jackets. What was walking toward his diner right now was something else entirely. A knock came at the boarded door, calm, almost polite 3 measured raps that felt far more terrifying than any violent pounding could have been. "Robert Hale." A voice called from outside, deep and unhurried, carrying the kind of authority that came only from decades of being obeyed without question. "We know you're in there, and we both know running from this conversation any longer isn't going to change how it ends." Robert's entire body went rigid. Sarah felt it too, the way the temperature in the room seemed to drop instantly, the way even the old building itself seemed to hold its breath. "That's not Curtis," she whispered. "No," Robert said quietly, his voice carrying 30 years of dread finally catching up to him all at once. "That's Decker." He moved toward the boarded door slowly, each step heavy with the weight of a debt he'd spent half his life trying to outrun, finally arriving exactly where he always knew deep down it eventually would. "Robert, don't," Sarah whispered urgently, grabbing his arm. "Please." He paused, looking back at her, at the fear in her eyes, at the diner that had become his entire world for 20 quiet years, and for just a moment, something old and tired and impossibly sad passed across his face. "I have to," he said softly, "before he decides to bring this conversation through the walls instead of through the door." He gently pulled his arm free, walked the remaining steps toward the entrance, and placed his hand on the deadbolt. Outside, in the cold darkness beyond the door, 20 armed men stood waiting, and somewhere among them, a man named Decker stood patiently, finally, face to face, through nothing but a few inches of plywood, with the ghost he'd spent 30 years hunting. Robert took one last breath, the same calm, controlled breath he'd taken before every dangerous moment in his old life, and slowly turned the lock. The door swung open, and there he was. Decker hadn't changed the way Robert expected him to. 30 years should have softened him, should have bent him the way age bends every man eventually. But the figure standing in the doorway looked carved from the same hard, unforgiving stone. He'd always been silver-haired now. Deep lines cut into his face like scars from years of carrying grudges too heavy to set down, but his eyes hadn't dulled one bit. If anything, they burned colder than Robert remembered. "Robert Hale," Decker said slowly, like he was tasting the name after 30 years of starving for it. "I gotta admit, when my men told me you were running a diner flipping eggs for truckers in the middle of nowhere, I almost didn't believe it." "Hello, Decker." Robert's voice was steady, carefully empty of the fear churning underneath. "Been a long time." 31 years, 3 months. Decker's jaw tightened. "I counted every single one of them." Behind him, the men spread out across the gravel lot, fanning into a loose, deliberate formation. Not the chaotic, undisciplined mess Curtis's enforcers had been, but something far more practiced, far more dangerous. Men who'd done this before. Men who knew exactly how to surround a building so nothing inside it had anywhere left to run. Sarah stood frozen near the kitchen doorway, her hand pressed against her mouth, watching the exchange with wide, terrified eyes. "You gonna invite me in?" Decker said. "Or are we doing this on your porch like a couple of door-to-door salesmen?" Robert hesitated only a second before stepping back, allowing the door to swing open fully. "Come in. Just you." Decker's mouth twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Careful now. Sounds like you're trying to negotiate terms, and you lost the right to negotiate anything the day you ran off with my men's blood money." "I'm not negotiating," Robert said quietly. "I'm asking you not to bring this into a building with people who had nothing to do with what happened 30 years ago." For a long moment, Decker studied him. Really studied him the way old enemies study each other when they finally meet again after decades of imagining the moment. Then he turned, said something low to the men behind him, and stepped through the doorway alone, leaving the rest of his crew waiting in the cold night air outside. The door closed behind him with a soft final click. "Sit," Decker said, gesturing toward the nearest booth like he owned the place. "We got history to discuss, and I didn't drive 400 miles to do it standing up." Robert sat, slowly, carefully. Sarah remained frozen by the kitchen, and Decker's eyes flicked toward her briefly before dismissing her as irrelevant. "She stays out of this," Robert said firmly. "She's still breathing, ain't she? Consider that mercy." Decker leaned back, lacing his fingers together on the table. "Now, let's talk about Marcus, about Tommy, about little Petey, who was barely 20 years old when he caught a bullet in that warehouse you were supposed to be guarding." Robert's stomach twisted with old familiar guilt. "I never lifted a weapon that night, Decker. You know that. I know you stood there." Decker snapped, his calm cracking for the first time, raw fury bleeding through. "I know you watched 3 of my brothers die and did nothing to stop it. And then I know you took the money meant to make things right between our chapters, and you vanished like smoke. 31 years, Robert. 31 years I've had to look my brothers' families in the eye and tell them the man responsible was never found. I'm not responsible for their deaths." Robert said, his voice low but firm. "I'm responsible for not stopping it. There's a difference. Not to me, there ain't." Decker's eyes were hard as flint now. "You want to know something funny, Robert? I spent 30 years building an empire bigger than anything our old chapters ever dreamed of. Got more men, more money, more power than I know what to do with. And none of it, not one single bit of it, ever filled the hole those 3 deaths left in me." He leaned forward. "So don't sit there and tell me about responsibility. You don't know the meaning of the word. The diner felt suffocatingly small in that moment, the air thick with 30 years of grief curdled into something dark and unyielding. "What do you want, Decker?" Robert asked quietly. "You didn't drive 400 miles with 20 men just to lecture me." Decker's expression shifted, calculated, now businesslike. "I want what's owed, not the money. Money's worthless to me at this point. I want you to stand in front of those 3 families and confess exactly what you did. I want you to feel, even for one moment, what it's like to lose everything you built because of somebody else's failure. And if I refuse, then I burn this little life you built right down to the ground," Decker said simply, without a trace of hesitation. "Startin' with this diner. Maybe that waitress hiding by the kitchen. Maybe that old man who's apparently been running around town acting like your eyes and ears." His smile was cold and humorless. "I know about Frank, Robert. I know everything. I've had 3 days to learn this whole sad little town inside and out." Robert's hands curled into fists beneath the table, every old instinct screaming at him to act, to fight, to protect. But he forced himself to remain still, knowing that one wrong move right now could doom everyone he'd come to care about over these past 20 years. "Give me until tomorrow," Robert said finally. "Let me say goodbye to this town properly. Let me make arrangements. And then I'll go with you willingly, and you can do whatever you need to do." Decker studied him for a long, silent moment. "You're not going to fight this. I've spent 30 years running from consequences I should have faced a long time ago," Robert said quietly. "Maybe it's time I stopped." Something flickered across Decker's face, not quite respect, but something adjacent to it. "Tomorrow night, sundown. You come alone to the old Henderson barn, and we settle this the way it should have been settled 3 decades ago." He stood slowly, straightening his jacket. "And Robert, if you try to run again, if you try anything clever, I burn this whole town down looking for you. Every building, every person who ever knew your name. You understand me?" "I understand." Decker nodded, once turned and walked back out into the night without another word. Through the window, Robert and Sarah watched as the cars pulled away one by one, headlights cutting through the darkness, disappearing down Route 9 like a retreating storm that promised to return. The moment the last car vanished from sight, Sarah's composure shattered completely. She rushed toward Robert, her hands shaking violently. "You're not actually going there tomorrow," she said, voice cracking. "Robert, please tell me you're not seriously considering walking into that barn alone." Robert sat motionless for a long moment, staring at the door Decker had just walked through. "I don't have a choice, Sarah." "Yes, you do. We call the police. We call the FBI. We call somebody. And tell them what—" Robert's voice rose slightly, frustration and fear bleeding through his usually calm demeanor. "That a biker gang from 30 years ago wants revenge for something that happened in a warehouse that's probably been demolished for 2 decades, Decker's smart Sarah. He's not stupid enough to leave evidence behind. By the time any law enforcement agency takes this seriously, he'll have already done whatever he came here to do." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, frustration and fear tangled together. "Then we fight. You said yourself you used to be whatever it is you used to be. Surely you can—" "Against 20 armed men with 30 years of hatred behind them." Robert shook his head slowly. "Sarah, I'm good. I was very good once. But I'm not a miracle worker. That's not a fight I walk away from, not against those numbers." "So you're just going to let him kill you?" Robert's silence was heavier than any answer could have been. "No," he said finally quietly. "I'm going to try to give them something more valuable than my death. I'm going to try to give them the truth finally after 30 years of running from it. Maybe that's enough. Maybe it isn't. But it's the only chance I have of walking out of that barn alive, and even if I don't, at least this town, at least you won't be the ones paying for what I did." Sarah collapsed into the nearest booth, burying her face in her hands, the weight of everything finally crashing down on her all at once. Robert sat beside her, gently placing a hand on her shoulder, the same calloused, gentle hand that flipped eggs every morning and dismantled armed men in seconds. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I know," Robert said softly. "I am too." The next morning brought a tension to Millbrook that everyone could feel, even those who didn't fully understand why. Frank arrived at the diner before sunrise, his face pale and drawn, having heard from Sarah late the previous night exactly what was coming. "You can't do this alone, Bobby," Frank said immediately. "Let me come with you." "Absolutely not." Robert's voice left no room for argument. "Decker said alone, and I intend to honor that. The moment he sees backup, this whole thing falls apart, and people get hurt who don't deserve to." "Then let me at least—" The bell above the door jingled, cutting Frank off mid-sentence. Both men turned instinctively tense, only to find Walter Briggs standing in the doorway leaning on his cane, his expression grim and urgent. "Robert," Walter said without preamble, "we need to talk, now." "Walter, I don't have time." "You're going to want to make time for this." Walter limped further into the diner, lowering himself heavily into the nearest booth. "I heard about Decker showing up last night. Whole network's buzzing about it already." "How could you possibly know that already?" "Because I've been keeping tabs on this situation since the moment I left here, Bobby. Couldn't just walk away after warning you and forget about it." Walter's weathered face was etched with something close to desperation. "Listen to me carefully. You go to that barn tonight, you're walking into a death sentence. Decker ain't interested in your confession. He's interested in making an example so brutal that nobody in our old world ever forgets what happens to men who run." "I don't have a choice, Walter." "Yes, you do." Walter's eyes were intense, urgent. "There were witnesses that night, Bobby, in the warehouse. People who saw exactly what happened, who know you weren't the one who pulled triggers. People who could testify that the real blame belonged to Decker's own lieutenant, who set up that deal knowing it was a setup from the start." Robert's breath caught. "What are you talking about?" "The deal that night," Walter said, leaning forward urgently. "It wasn't a deal gone bad, Bobby. It was a setup. Decker's own second-in-command, a man named Reyes, sold out the meeting location to a rival crew looking to make a name for themselves. Reyes wanted Decker's position, and he got it 2 years later when Decker's grief made him reckless, and half the chapter abandoned him. Reyes used those 3 deaths to climb his way to the top of a rival organization that eventually merged with Decker's own crew." The pieces clicked together in Robert's mind with sickening clarity. "Decker doesn't know. Decker spent 30 years looking for somebody to blame, and you handed yourself to him on a silver platter by running the way you did," Walter said. "If you'd stayed, if you'd fought to prove what really happened, this whole nightmare might have ended differently. But you ran and running made you look guilty enough that nobody ever questioned it further." Sarah, who had been listening intently from behind the counter, stepped forward urgently. "Can you prove this right now before tonight?" Walter hesitated. "I know a man. Old-timer used to run with Reyes's crew before he got out clean about 15 years back. He's been carrying guilt about what happened that night for just as long as Robert has. If anybody could confirm the truth, it's him." "Where is he?" Robert asked, urgency cutting through his exhaustion. 2 hours from here. If we leave now, we might make it back before sundown." Walter struggled to his feet, leaning heavily on his cane. "It's a long shot, Bobby, but it's better odds than walking into that barn with nothing but a confession that might not even be true." Robert looked at Sarah, then at Frank, both watching him with desperate hope flickering in their eyes. Hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of this that didn't end with him bleeding out in an abandoned barn. "Let's go," Robert said. The drive felt impossibly long, every mile pressing down on Robert's chest like a physical weight, the clock ticking relentlessly toward a sundown deadline that grew closer with every passing minute. Walter directed them down increasingly rural roads, until they finally arrived at a modest farmhouse on the outskirts of a small town none of them had ever heard of. The old man who answered the door, Eduardo Reyes's former associate, a weathered, weary man named Salazar, listened to their plea with growing horror, the guilt of 30 years finally breaking through decades of careful silence. "I always knew this day would come," Salazar said quietly, sitting heavily in his worn armchair. "I should have come forward years ago, should have told Decker the truth the moment Reyes started climbing his way up, using those deaths as his foundation. Will you tell him now?" Robert asked, desperation barely contained beneath his careful composure. "Tonight, before sundown." Salazar's hands trembled slightly. Decker's not going to want to hear that the real villain in his story has been standing beside him for 30 years profiting off his grief. Men like that don't take kindly to having their whole worldview shattered. He's going to kill an innocent man tonight if somebody doesn't tell him the truth, Sarah said urgently. Please, you said you've carried this guilt for 15 years. Here's your chance to finally set it right. Salazar looked between all of them for a long, heavy moment, the weight of 3 decades of silence finally cracking under the pressure of the present moment. All right, he said finally, rising slowly from his chair. Let's go tell Decker the truth he's been running from, just as long as Robert's been running from him. Outside, the sun was already beginning its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in deep bruised oranges and reds. A countdown made visible ticking down toward a confrontation that would either save Robert's life or end it permanently inside the walls of an abandoned barn. The Henderson barn sat at the edge of a dying cornfield, its wood gone gray with age, and by the time Robert's truck rolled up the dirt path toward it, the sun had already dipped low enough to bleed orange across the horizon. Walter sat in the passenger seat, Salazar in the back, his hands clasped tightly together like a man praying for the first time in years. "You sure about this?" Robert asked, glancing at Salazar in the rearview mirror. "No," Salazar admitted, voice trembling. "But I'm more sure about this than I am about letting an innocent man die for something I helped cover up." Robert pulled the truck to a stop 100 yards from the barn, where Decker's men had already gathered in loose formation, headlights from their vehicles cutting harsh white beams across the dirt. Curtis Lane's black SUV sat parked off to the side as well. Robert's stomach dropped at the sight of it. "He's here too," Robert muttered. "Curtis, guess the snake wanted a front row seat," Walter said grimly. Robert stepped out of the truck, slowly, hands visible, every muscle in his body coiled tight with controlled tension. Decker emerged from the barn's open doorway, flanked by 2 of his lieutenants, his expression unreadable in the dying light. "You brought company," Decker said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "I said alone, Robert." "I brought the truth," Robert said evenly. "Something you've been missing for 30 years. Decker's eyes narrowed, flicking toward Walter, then settling on Salazar with sudden, sharp recognition. "Salazar, that you old man thought you disappeared off the map years ago." "I did," Salazar said, stepping forward, despite the visible tremor in his hands. "Disappeared because I couldn't live with myself anymore, knowing what I knew and saying nothing." "Knowing what?" Decker's voice had dropped low, dangerous. Behind him, more men filtered out of the barn, drawn by the tension crackling in the air. Curtis emerged among them, his eyes darting between Robert and Decker, with the calculating hunger of a man trying to figure out how to profit from whatever was about to happen. "The warehouse," Salazar said, forcing the words out like they physically pained him. "The night Marcus, Tommy, and Petey died. It wasn't a deal gone bad, Decker. It was a setup. Reyes sold the location to that rival crew. He wanted your chapter weakened. Wanted you weakened specifically so he could move into the power vacuum once you fell apart from grief." The barn fell into a silence so absolute that Robert could hear his own heartbeat hammering in his ears. Decker's face went through a rapid, violent series of emotions. Confusion, disbelief, and finally a cold, simmering fury that seemed to radiate off him like heat off asphalt. "You're lying." "I wish I was," Salazar said, tears welling in his old, tired eyes. "I've carried this for 15 years, Decker. Watched Reyes climb to the top of his own empire using your grief as the foundation. Watched him let you believe Robert was responsible while he profited off the very deaths he orchestrated. Reyes is dead," Decker said, his voice shaking now. "Died of a heart attack 3 years ago. You're telling me I can't even—" "You can't make him pay," Salazar confirmed. "But you can stop punishing the wrong man for a sin that was never his to carry." Decker turned slowly toward Robert, something fractured and raw breaking through his hardened exterior. "Is this true? You knew about this?" "I didn't know," Robert said honestly. "Not until yesterday. I ran because I felt guilty for not stopping what happened, guilty enough to believe I deserved whatever punishment came eventually. I never knew the deal itself was rigged from the start." For a long, agonizing moment, Decker stood frozen. 30 years of carefully constructed hatred crumbling beneath the weight of a truth he'd never expected to hear. His men watched him uncertainly, sensing the shift in their leader, unsure what came next. 31 years. Decker finally whispered more to himself than anyone else. 31 years I hated the wrong man. It was in that exact moment of fractured vulnerability that Curtis Lane made his fatal mistake. "This doesn't change nothin'," Curtis said loudly, stepping forward with reckless, desperate bravado. "Hale's still responsible for what happened in my town. Still owes me for what he did to my men." Decker's head snapped toward him, fury rapidly redirecting itself toward a new, much closer target. "Your men attacked his diner unprovoked, from what I hear. And you're trying to use my history with him to settle your own petty extortion racket. I just figured, you figured wrong." Decker's voice carried a lethal calm, now far more terrifying than his earlier rage. "You used my pain as a tool, boy. Tried to ride my vendetta into getting what you wanted out of this old man. That's the kind of move that gets people killed in my world." Curtis's bravado faltered, for the first time his eyes darting toward his own men, searching for backup that suddenly seemed very far away. "Decker, I didn't mean no disrespect. I just thought—" "You thought you could use a 30-year-old tragedy to bully a diner cook into paying you protection money." Decker's lieutenants shifted subtly, sensing where this was heading, slowly repositioning themselves around Curtis's much smaller group. That's the kind of small, ugly thinking that gets ambitious little men exactly nowhere. The tension in the air sharpened into something physical. Something that made Robert's old instincts scream danger. Sarah, who had insisted on following, despite Robert's protests, and now stood watching from beside the truck with Frank, felt her heart pounding violently in her chest. "This is it," Frank whispered. "This is where it goes bad." But Robert stepped forward instead, placing himself directly between the two rival groups, his hands raised in a gesture of calm authority that instantly drew every eye toward him. "Enough." Robert said, his voice carrying the same commanding weight it must have carried decades ago, back when he'd been a different man entirely. "Decker, you came here for closure on something that's haunted you for 30 years. You got it. The truth, even if it's not the truth you expected." He turned slightly toward Curtis. "And you came here looking to profit off chaos that was never yours to exploit. That ends tonight too. Who do you think you are?" Curtis snapped, some of his bravado returning now that the immediate threat from Decker seemed to be shifting. "Giving orders like you're still some big-shot biker enforcer." "I'm the man who beat 3 of your men without breaking a sweat," Robert said calmly. "And I'm the man standing between you and 20 armed men who just realized you've been using their grief for your own gain. If I were you, I'd consider very carefully how this next minute goes." Curtis's confidence cracked visibly, his eyes darting between Decker's stone-faced lieutenants and Robert's unflinching calm. Decker stepped forward, then his expression, unreadable, studying Robert with an intensity that made the air feel impossibly thin. 31 years, he said again, slower this time. "I built a war in my head against you, Robert. Imagined this confrontation 1,000 different ways. Never once imagined it endin' with me thanking you." Thanking me, Robert's surprise was genuine, "for telling the truth tonight instead of just letting me kill you for a sin that wasn't yours to bear." Decker's jaw tightened, old grief finally finding somewhere honest to settle. "Don't mistake this for forgiveness, Robert. You still ran. You still left without facing what happened, without even trying to find out the real truth yourself. That cowardice cost me 31 years of misdirected hatred that could have been spent hunting down the actual man responsible while he was still alive to answer for it." "You're right," Robert said quietly, accepting the weight of that truth without flinching. "I ran because I was scared and broken and didn't know how to face any of it. That's on me. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Decker. I'm just grateful you came here willing to listen before pulling a trigger." For a long, heavy moment, the two old enemies simply stared at each other, 3 decades of pain and misunderstanding, finally settling into something that resembled, if not peace, at least an uneasy truce. Then Decker turned sharply toward Curtis, his expression hardening instantly back into cold authority. "As for you," he said, "I think it's time you and your little gang learned exactly what happens to men who try to profit off other people's wars." Curtis's men exchanged nervous glances, several of them already inching backward toward their vehicles, sensing the shifting tide before their leader did. "Wait," Curtis said, panic finally breaking through his crumbling composure. "We can work something out, Decker. I didn't mean—" "You meant exactly what you said," Decker interrupted coldly. "You wanted my reputation to do your dirty work. Now you're gonna learn that borrowing a wolf's name don't make you one." Decker's men moved with practiced, terrifying efficiency, closing in around Curtis's group within seconds. Curtis's enforcers, the same men in fact who had broken into Robert's diner days earlier, scrambled backward hands, raised all bravado, completely evaporated. "Decker, please." Curtis's voice cracked with genuine terror now. It was Robert who stepped in once more, his presence carrying unexpected weight in this moment of impending violence. "Decker, let him go." Decker turned surprised. "After everything he tried to pull, he's a desperate small man who got in over his head," Robert said. "Killing him here tonight doesn't undo what happened 30 years ago, and it doesn't give either of us back anything we lost. Let the law handle him. Let Millbrook handle him. Violence answering violence is exactly the kind of cycle that's kept both of us trapped for 31 years. Decker studied Robert for a long contemplative moment, something shifting subtly behind his weathered eyes. "You've changed," he said finally. "The Robert I remembered wouldn't have hesitated to let me handle this however I saw fit." "The Robert you remember died a long time ago," Robert said quietly. "What's standing here now is somebody who spent 20 years learning that mercy matters more than vengeance ever did." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then, Decker slowly gave a single sharp nod to his men, who released their grip on Curtis's terrified enforcers. "Get out of here," Decker said coldly to Curtis. "And if I ever hear my name used to threaten innocent people again, mercy won't be on the table next time." Curtis didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled toward his SUV, his men following in a chaotic, undignified retreat, engines roaring to life and tires kicking up dust as they fled into the darkening evening, leaving behind every shred of the menace they'd once carried into Millbrook. Sarah, watching from beside the truck, finally allowed herself to breathe. "Is it over?" she whispered to Frank. "I think," Frank said slowly, watching the taillights disappear into the night. "It might actually be." Decker lingered a while longer, his men slowly dispersing back toward their vehicles, the barn emptying out as the last traces of orange sunlight gave way to deep blue twilight. He approached Robert one final time, his expression unreadable, carrying the exhausted weight of 31 years finally beginning to lift. "What happens now?" Robert asked quietly. "I go home," Decker said. "Try to figure out how to live with 30 years of hatred that turned out to be aimed at the wrong man." He paused, studying Robert carefully. "And you go back to your diner, back to your quiet little life. You're not going to come after me again." Decker shook his head slowly. "What would be the point Robert killing you now wouldn't bring Marcus, Tommy, or Petey back? Wouldn't undo 31 years of misplaced anger. All it'd do is add another body to a pile that's already too damn high." He extended a hand, hesitant, almost foreign in its gentleness. "Consider this debt closed. Not forgiven, just closed." Robert hesitated only a moment before shaking it, the weight of 3 decades finally truly lifting off his shoulders for the first time since that warehouse all those years ago. "Thank you," Robert said. "Don't thank me," Decker said gruffly, already turning to leave. "Thank Salazar for finally finding the courage to tell the truth. And thank whatever twist of fate sent you running to a quiet little town that turned out to have more decent people in it than most places I've known in my whole damn life." He walked back toward his vehicle without another word, his remaining men following silently behind him, and within minutes, the entire convoy had disappeared down the dirt road, leaving the Henderson barn in eerie, peaceful silence. Salazar approached Robert slowly. relief and exhaustion etched deeply into every line of his weathered face. "Guess we both got something close to absolution tonight," he said. "Guess we did," Robert agreed quietly. The drive back to Millbrook felt different than the drive out had lighter somehow, despite the bone-deep exhaustion settling into every part of Robert's body. Sarah sat beside him in the passenger seat, now having switched places with Walter at some point during the chaos, her hand resting gently on his arm. "You did it," she said softly. "You actually walked into that and came out the other side." "We did it," Robert corrected. "All of us." When they finally pulled back into the gravel lot outside the diner, the building stood waiting, exactly as it always had, quiet weathered, unremarkable to anyone who didn't know the storm that had just been weathered to keep it standing. Robert sat there for a long moment, just looking at it, feeling something complicated and overwhelming settle in his chest. "What now?" Sarah asked. "Now," Robert said slowly. "I think it's finally time to put that box away for good." Word of what happened at the Henderson barn spread through Millbrook within days, growing and shifting with every retelling until the story took on an almost legendary quality among the townsfolk. The Black Vipers, stripped of their leader's confidence after Curtis's humiliating retreat, began falling apart almost immediately. Several of his enforcers, including Dale, simply disappeared from town, unwilling to stick around for whatever consequences might still be coming. Curtis himself made one final desperate attempt to reassert control 2 weeks later, showing up at the diner alone, looking far smaller and far less menacing than he had that first day he'd walked in, demanding $200. "I just wanted to say," Curtis began awkwardly, standing near the door, like he wasn't quite sure he was welcome. "What happened out there? It wasn't personal, Robert. I was just trying to build something for myself." Robert studied him for a long moment, seeing past the bravado to the scared, directionless young man underneath it all, not unlike the scared, directionless young man he himself had once been, all those decades ago before Brotherhood twisted into something far darker than it should have. "You want to build something for yourself," Robert said finally. "Build it on something other than other people's fear. That's the only advice I've got for you." Curtis nodded slowly, something almost like genuine reflection crossing his face for the first time since he'd arrived in Millbrook. "Sheriff's already talked to me," he admitted. "Looking at some serious charges from the diner attack. Probably gonna do some time." "Probably," Robert agreed. "For what it's worth," Curtis said, turning toward the door. "I'm sorry. For all of it. For all." He left quietly, and word came 2 weeks later that he'd been arrested along with what remained of his crew, the Black Vipers finally collapsing entirely under the weight of pending charges and a complete loss of the fear they'd once relied on to control the town. Millbrook, for the first time in months, finally exhaled. Robert rebuilt the diner's front door properly that following week, replacing the temporary plywood with sturdy new wood and fresh glass that caught the morning sunlight just right. Frank helped him with the work, the two of them falling into easy, comfortable silence, punctuated by old stories and quiet laughter, the kind of friendship that had survived even the revelation of 30 years of hidden history. "You ever gonna tell me the rest of it?" Frank asked one afternoon, hammering a final nail into place. "The whole story, not just the parts that came spilling out during all this chaos." Robert considered the question for a long moment. "Maybe someday, Frank. When I'm ready to remember all of it, without it hurtin' quite so much." "Take your time," Frank said simply. "I ain't going anywhere." Sarah, who had taken to spending even more time at the diner since everything settled, found herself looking at Robert differently now, not with less respect, but with a deeper, more complicated understanding of exactly what kind of strength it took for a man to bury a violent past and build something gentle and good in its place. "Can I ask you something?" she said one evening as they closed up together, the new door finally complete and gleaming under the diner's warm interior lights. "Always. Do you regret it? Any of it? The angels, the violence, all of it?" Robert thought about the question carefully before answering, his eyes drifting toward the steel box he'd finally moved from his apartment down to a small shelf behind the counter. No longer hidden, no longer something shameful to bury, but simply a part of his history, now acknowledged and accepted. I regret the parts of myself that thought violence was the only language strong enough to matter, he said slowly. I regret not having the courage all those years ago to walk away from that warehouse and report what I saw instead of just running. He paused, glancing toward Sarah with something gentle and warm in his tired eyes. But I don't regret who I became after. I don't regret this diner or this town or the people who somehow ended up mattering to me more than I ever thought possible after everything I'd done. Sarah smiled softly. I'm glad you ran here then. To Millbrook. To this diner. So am I, Robert said quietly. So am I. Months passed and Millbrook slowly returned to its old comfortable rhythm. Mornings filled with the smell of bacon and fresh coffee, regulars trading gossip in familiar booths. The gentle hum of small-town life continuing on undisturbed by the storm that had so briefly threatened to consume it entirely. The faded photograph behind the register remained exactly where it had always been, though now it sat beside a small framed leather patch, no longer hidden, no longer something to be ashamed of, but simply a quiet reminder of a long and difficult journey that had finally, after 31 years, reached something resembling peace. Robert still woke before dawn. Every morning, still flipped bacon with the same steady, practiced rhythm, still poured coffee for the same loyal regulars who'd stuck by him through everything. But there was something different in him now, a lightness that hadn't been there before, a peace that came from finally facing the ghosts he'd spent decades running from. Sarah eventually took on more responsibility at the diner, learning every recipe, every customer's preference, every small detail that made Hale's Diner feel like home to the people of Millbrook. Robert began quietly preparing her to take over someday, though neither of them spoke of it directly, both understanding without words that the diner's future rested gently naturally in her capable hands. You know, Frank said one morning, sitting in his usual booth, newspaper folded in front of him like always. This town's a lot quieter now, almost like it never happened. Robert poured his coffee, smiling faintly. Some things are better left quiet, Frank. Maybe so. Frank took a sip, satisfied. But I'll tell you this much, I sleep a whole lot better knowing the man pouring my coffee every morning is exactly the kind of man who'd burn his whole world down before he'd let harm come to the people he cares about. Robert said nothing, just continued his work. The warmth of the morning sun spilling gently through the new front door, illuminating a diner that had survived violence, betrayal, and 31 years of buried history to emerge finally into something resembling peace. Because in the end, Robert Hale's story was never really about the violence he'd once been capable of, or the brutal legend that still occasionally whispered through certain dangerous corners of a world he'd long since left behind. It was about the quiet, deliberate choice he made every single morning to set that violence aside, to pour coffee instead of throwing punches, to build something gentle and lasting out of the wreckage of who he used to be. The leather patch remained locked safely behind the counter, not as a weapon, not as a threat, but as a reminder, proof that even the most dangerous men, given enough time and enough courage, could choose something better than the path they'd once walked. And in the small, unremarkable town of Millbrook, that choice mattered more than any legend ever could. Robert Hale had been a legend once, a name whispered in fear across dangerous corners of a world most people never saw. But in the end, he chose to become something far rarer, far more powerful than any legend ever was. He chose to become simply, quietly a good man. And that, in the end, was the only legacy that ever truly mattered.